Welcome to the Crypto Teacher. And guys, I come back with that video just to make you think. Now we have Joe Biden announces his chief of staff, which is Ron Klain. And of course, he has a history in the actual office. Of course, lastly, he was with Obama. Now we know that he was in charge of the Ebola event. Now also, we know that when they first started the C word, they asked him about the C word. Oh, it's no big deal. He also said that we were perfectly fine in handling it if it does come here. We're definitely prepared. Now, all of a sudden, guys, that has changed. Now, guys, I am not making this up. I am not making this up. Now, guys, we know predictive programming. Now, so what we have going on right now, we have Trump versus Biden and the recount. Guess what? He was in office when Gore and Bush did the actual recount. And actually, with the movie called Recount with Kevin Spacey plays him in the movie, guys. I cannot make this up. Y'all enjoy the video.
The president-elect has chosen the first top member of his new administration. That's his longtime advisor, Ron Klain. He will become White House chief of staff. Klain was the former vice president's #1 aide at the start of the Obama administration. At O'Keefe
this year, Ron Klain explains the Biden plan to tackle coronavirus.
The Biden plan starts with fixing Trump's testing fiasco. He'd make sure that all Americans have access to regular, reliable, and free testing.
Picking Klain as his chief of staff, Mr. Biden shows the emphasis his administration plans to place on the pandemic. Klain served as the Ebola response coordinator during the 2014 outbreak.
Backlash over the country's response to Ebola is leading President Obama to consider it a so-called czar. That person would oversee efforts to contain the virus. Until now, some reporters wondered who's in charge.
So the point is,
interrupting me because you feel like you have a point to make, but you understand my question.
Well, no, I think the point that I have to make is directly relevant.
You seem to be reluctant to say who's in charge of the federal response to Ebola.
Jim, I think that I'm reciting very clearly to you who specifically is responsible for which activities when it comes to this government's tenacious response to Ebola. So
there's not one person in charge.
I think that there are individuals who are directly responsible for their line of responsibility.
Our Dr. David Agus is here. Good morning. You can understand why there's so much confusion here about who's in charge. Why don't we know at this point?
Well, it's a very difficult question. The CDC is supposedly in charge, but they have no authority over individual hospitals. There are 5,000 hospitals and 2,500 public health departments in the country. And our country's constitution says states are in charge of health, not the federal government.
So do we need a czar?
Obama for days said, we don't need a czar, there's no need. Now, all of a sudden, the tune is changing. And I think we do. We're getting such mixed messages. There was new data that came out last night showing that at 21 days, when we said the incubation period is over, you're free, 12% of people, up to 12%, can actually still have symptoms after 21 days. So we're told one thing, and then the data are showing another. We're told as if it's black and white, and most of the time it's not clear data. So we need real leadership to get behavior change.
Is certainly no stranger to Washington. He's also has been in the White House numerous times before. He was chief of staff to Vice President Joe Biden, where he worked on the Stimulus Act in 2009. And he also worked on the very controversial Solyndra deal, which was a California solar panel maker that went bankrupt after receiving millions and millions of dollars from the government. He was also chief of staff to former Vice President Al Gore and to former Attorney General Janet Reno, and spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill and in government. He was also worked as a lobbyist. Republicans are criticizing the White House for bringing in someone who is essentially a political operative and who has spent his life in politics and law, rather than someone who is a physician or an infectious disease expert. So they've definitely been roundly criticized for that, especially since he's been so involved in Democratic politics.
But I think that the legacy of the Obama presidency is going to be one of the most significant in our time.
The White House has definitely said that mistakes have been made and that missteps have been made with the U.S.'s response to the Ebola outbreak kind of across the board. Klain will not usurp the CDC. They are doing a public health thing. This is more of a Washington-based response. The White House is really touting his business expertise, his organizational expertise, and the fact that he's really been around D.C. So he knows quite a bit of people, which is, they feel as though they need someone who can work between all the different stakeholders and all the different agencies, and there certainly will be quite a few given the urgency that is felt with the Ebola outbreak here in the U.S. Perhaps one of Klain's biggest claims to fame is that he was played by Kevin Spacey before in the HBO movie Recount about the Bush-Gore election.
And what's your level of concern right now, Ron, about this spreading to the U.S.?
Yes, Sarah, so I'd say I'm concerned but not fearful. I think, as Dr. Gottlieb said, we have already seen 5 cases in the U.S. We'll probably see more. 8,000 people arrive in our country every day from China. And I think the most important thing to understand right now is there are a lot of unknowns. We really don't know how widespread this is in China. We don't know how effective the quarantine measures have been there. We don't know what the mechanism for transmitting it human to human. And we don't know, there are reports that, in fact, people can spread the disease even though they don't have symptoms. So I think there are a lot of unknowns. I think that we need to be prepared in this country, and we need to be ready for it.
So talk a little bit about that, your time in the Obama administration dealing with Ebola. What similarities and differences can you tell at this point?
Yeah, so similarities are we were worried then, of course, about the disease coming from a foreign country to the U.S. That's what's the same. There are a couple really big differences here. The first is the level of people coming from these countries. About 500 people a day come to the U.S. from West Africa. 8,000 a day come to the U.S. from China. So a lot more people coming to a lot more airports, right? Much bigger challenge. The second is the screening question. We knew with Ebola that if we got people before they developed a fever, we could isolate them. They couldn't spread the disease. Again, there's just a lot of uncertainties about this new coronavirus. So I think actually in some ways the differences are greater than the similarities. A lot of the structures we put in place during the Ebola epidemic will work for the Trump administration if they use them, but the circumstance is different.
Well, if you were the coronavirus czar, given what you're saying about 8,000 people a day arriving from China, and not necessarily being able to ascertain whether they actually have the virus, given they may not be showing any symptoms, would you ban Chinese travelers from arriving in the United States?
I wouldn't. I think that's premature. I think it's very important exchange, very important for trade and tourism, and the very, very few of those people will have it. What's more, since this virus broke out, 250,000 people have come from China, so they're already here in the U.S. Americans go back and forth all the time for business, for culture. The CDC issued a travel warning, but there's still Americans traveling. So, look, I think what we really need to do is to be ready. We need to invest in and make sure we are screening people at airports. We need to make sure our hospitals are ready, as Dr. Gottlieb said earlier on your show. And I think we need to make sure that we're making the kinds of steps to prepare for the outbreaks we'll see here in the U.S.
Ron, how do you read China's response so far? Does it live up to global standards in your estimation?
Well, I'd say, Sarah, it's a great question. I'd say it's a mixed bag. I think on the one hand, China has been more candid and transparent than in past outbreaks. But I still think there are some hard questions about whether or not they are being candid and transparent. Their case count seems extremely low compared to what most of the expert models say is going on in China. Whether or not they've been honest about what's happened and how it's happened, I still think remains to be seen. And I think also there's just some confusion there, as there isn't any outbreak. So even if they mean to be candid and transparent, the information may be wrong. So I think it's very important that we, stay on top of the science. We stay on top of the developments. We listen to what the Chinese are saying, but we don't take their word for it. I just think there's lots of things to be doubted in what they're telling us.
Well, if travel restrictions on nearly 60 million residents is not candid, I would hate to see what candid actually looks like. I mean, how would you characterize the lockdowns they put in place relative to their real concerns?
So I'd say a couple things. One, they're reporting a couple thousand cases. There's models that say there are already 200,000 or 300,000 cases. So that's one question about candor and the extent of this. I also think we just don't really know how effective those lockdowns are. I mean, I was struck by the fact that the photos you saw yesterday out of Wuhan showed no cars leaving, but a long, long line of trucks coming into Wuhan, bringing food, bringing supplies. Well, what's going to happen to those truck drivers? Where are they going after they drop off all those supplies? So I just think again, it's early days, and I think we need to be really careful not to assume that what we're being told by the Chinese is true or untrue, to kind of trust but verify, or maybe not even trust but verify. And I think, we need to be on guard here in the U.S. with our own experts. We have the best experts in the world in the United States. We have great leadership in this field. We need to listen to those experts and take their advice.
You mentioned restrictions on human travel. Are we at a point where we need to think about restrictions on just physical goods? Do we know enough about the virus to think about that?
We don't know enough. I think there's no reason to fear trading goods at this point in time. Obviously, wildlife is a different situation. The Chinese have imposed restrictions on that, but I don't think there's any reason for us to worry about this virus coming on television sets or toasters or something like that.
Well, what about the 250,000 people who've already arrived here, as you pointed out, from China over the last several weeks or whatever it's been since we first learned about it? I mean, how confident can you be that certainly some of them are going to have had it and or get it, show signs of it. How confident can you be that hospitals are going to respond appropriately and prevent the spread of the virus?
So, look, we made a huge investment on a bipartisan basis in preparing 60 hospitals around the country after the Ebola outbreak in 2014 to be centers of specialty on infectious disease response and control. And those are, really, there's one of those in almost every major city. Those personnel there are trained to screen, they're trained to isolate. I think we have very strong facilities. Now, one challenge is that funding runs out in May and Congress hasn't yet renewed it. So if I were in the administration, I'd be going to Congress right now and making sure we're strengthening those hospitals and also making sure we're helping state and local governments. The burden is going to fall on them to track those people who are here in this country, to make sure they're not developing the disease, to make sure they're not spreading the disease. That is going to be a big challenge, a big stress on state and local public health departments. They need reinforcements because of the size and the scope of this challenge.
What would it take for the WHO to declare a global public health emergency?
That's a great question. I think they should have done that last week. I hope they will reconsider this week and do it. All the standards in the international health regulation for such a declaration exists. The disease now exists in multiple countries. It is spreading rapidly in China. And so I hope they will reconsider. I'm not sure why the emergency committee voted it down last week. They met 2 days, but I think they need to reconvene quickly, and I think they need to change that decision.
The world is better prepared today for an outbreak than it was, say, in 2014 when Ebola was in the headlines, but it doesn't mean we're prepared, right? So we've improved our global preparations, we've improved key resources around the world, we've improved some of the infrastructure, but fundamentally, the world remains unprepared for a serious epidemic. Now, the coronavirus may be that, it may not be that. The evidence suggests that it's probably not that, but it will come sooner or later. And the world really lacks the detection systems it needs, the response tools it needs, and the leadership it needs to really deal with that. So better prepared now than before, but not really ready for something that's coming our way, absolutely.
Ron Klain, who is the character that I play in the HBO film Recount. Because you're such a central character in the film and were such a central figure in the entire recount process, how do you look back on it now?
It's hard to look back on it and not have a lot of what ifs and doubts. But I do always remind people that whatever decisions we made, strategic choices we made, that were good or bad, right or wrong, at the end of the day, on the Saturday before this all ended, all 67 came away to get a different result out of the U.S. Supreme Court.
I hope what the film reveals is that there was a heck of a lot of detail, personal agendas, people perhaps unqualified for their jobs in positions of authority that will, I think, surprise, perhaps even shock people who really, in a way, have a kind of vague idea about what Florida was about.
I think that there is a lot of information in the film that wasn't known contemporaneously, that came out over the course of the years that followed. And I think this has been a little bit of a forgotten chapter in American history.